On this day, 1995, David Fincher's bruising suspense thriller Seven opened in theaters and became a runaway huge box office hit.
You want to come take a look at this?
A madman is loose,
Homicide's a homicide.
inspired by the 7 deadly sins.
Gluttony, greed.
I hate this city.
You can expect 5 more.
They know his motive.
His murders are his sermons to us.
They know his game.
I've gone and done it again.
7 deadly sins. 7 ways to die.
Have you ever seen anything like this? No.
7.
And we're back, like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Sunday morning here with me in New York. Once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. So there are so many memorable movie anniversaries this month. Tomorrow is a real big one. Today is also statistically significant, but significant in general, because this is a Gen X standard, one of our movies celebrating its 29th anniversary. It is one of the most unconventional, massive box office hits. It is not the sort of story where even if it's going to get great reviews and get big crowds opening night, this is not a word of mouth kind of movie. This is not a, oh my God, I love that movie so much. It's not an action film. It's not a franchise. But David Fincher's 1995 suspense thriller serial killer movie Seven opened on September 22nd, which I guess was a Friday. And it ended up grossing $327 million in its initial theatrical run 29 years ago. Do the math, inflation adjusted, time value of money. It might be the unlikeliest hit of its type of film ever. Because I don't put, for example, Stephen King's It, I don't put that in the same category because that's just a straight up horror film from a pre-existing literary property which already had been made into a ridiculously successful miniseries when I was in 11th grade. A 2-parter on ABC. Everyone was going crazy about that. It's not the same. But Seven was buzzed about. It didn't exactly come out of nowhere, but David Fincher wasn't David Fincher. And from a certain point of view, he's fortunate he got the gig directing Seven because of all the trouble that he had making Alien 3. Alien 3 should have been better. The film is okay on its own merits, but they made the wrong script into a movie. They fucked up the first 2 Alien films with Alien 3. That's not Fincher's fault. But Seven, I saw on its opening night. And the early reviews were very solid. Siskel and Ebert both gave it thumbs up. All of the local New York papers gave it the film favorable reviews. You go on Rotten Tomatoes now, the score is a little bit lower than it should be. It's like 83%. There are some people that just object to these kinds of movies in general. They're never going to give it a favorable rating when you have scenes of people being tortured or women in danger being tortured. But the film, by and large, got good reviews. And the previews were interesting. And Brad Pitt, of course, was a rising star. Morgan Freeman was just coming off Shawshank. And R. Lee Ermey, the late, great R. Lee Ermey, Gunnery Sergeant Hartman from Full Metal Jacket, the real-life drill sergeant, who became an actor, and then he had the TV show, Mail Call. He plays the police captain, or chief, and he's terrific. He originally auditioned for the role of John Doe, the killer. Spoiler alert, Kevin Spacey. It's not really a spoiler because the movie doesn't, this is not one of those kind of mysteries where you wonder who the killer is. But he ended up playing the captain. And again, you get into situations where you start imagining, for example, even at that time, an actor with Morgan Freeman's stature, you need somebody that could believably dress him down. R. Lee Ermey. From the same perspective as Arnold Schwarzenegger, give us somebody that could be the head of his CIA division, Omega Sector. Give me someone who could believably bark at Arnold Schwarzenegger and actually seem intimidating. They chose Charlton Heston in True Lies the previous year. R. Lee Ermey pointing his finger at Morgan Freeman is not out of place because of the prior identification with him as, I am Gunnery Sergeant Hartman, your senior drill instructor. Full Metal Jacket. So, as there are often these kinds of stories, and I love these kinds of stories, it wasn't always going to be Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman. They both seem so perfectly suited to their roles, especially Morgan. But there's a version of The Matrix, because you look at the different actors who were up for various roles, who turned down certain roles, or just said, I don't think this is right for me, pass, or it doesn't sound interesting. But there's a version of The Matrix. Denzel Washington has talked about the fact that one of his, not many, but one of his career regrets, he wasn't going to play the Morgan role. Denzel was still playing leads. He was offered the role of Price. And Denzel, he wasn't comfortable with the story, and he turned it down. Al Pacino was offered the Morgan Freeman role. So the version of The Matrix in which Denzel plays the Brad Pitt role and Big Al plays the Morgan Freeman role. And when I tell you there's no version of reality in which the movie is as good, there's no scenario in which that works. Denzel could have done it. The Denzel of that era, the Denzel of Virtuosity, which would have been better for him if he did Seven instead of Virtuosity. But Denzel was very busy in 1995. He had Crimson Tide opposite Gene Hackman, huge hit. He did Devil with a Blue Dress with a very young Don Cheadle. Didn't make much money, good movie, and he did Virtuosity. The problem is, if Al Pacino, you could just imagine some of the shtick that he pulls in Heat, an otherwise very serious movie with all the screaming and yelling. For Heat fans, I'm gonna do my Big Al impersonation from that movie. Just picture this, right? You still cast Gwyneth Paltrow. Let's just go crazy. We're gonna cast Gwyneth Paltrow anyway. Opposite Denzel. He probably wouldn't have done that. You know what? Let's go Sharon Stone. Sharon Stone opposite Denzel. That would work. The two detectives are talking about Detective Mill's wife. And what would Al Pacino, as Somerset, say? Oh, she's got a great ass! And you got your head all the way up it! Thank you, I'll be here all week. But you understand, all jokes aside, the casting seems fine on the surface, but the movie doesn't work. Because as much as Al Pacino is capable of gravitas, the Al Pacino of that era was giving very broad performances. He didn't dial it back until Donnie Brasco 2 years later. And he would have probably it would have been instead of Heat. And thank goodness Pacino did not play a detective in this movie, but instead played opposite Bobby D, his buddy, in Heat. Because those two guys made magic. Movie magic. This film would have probably just been a fascinating near miss if you have Al Pacino in the Morgan Freeman role. And I don't really think that Brad necessarily, I'm a big Brad Pitt fan, I don't necessarily think he does anything that interesting with the character. But he's well cast. And Brad was very conscious already of his image. He didn't want to just coast on his looks. That's why he did the movie California. That's why he's a True Romance, where he kind of just basically plays a stoner, and why he wanted to do something other than play conventional leading man kind of stuff after Legends of the Fall. So the casting is perfect. And Kevin Spacey, you talk about an actor, and I understand he's a notorious name now. I'm not here to defend or even defame Kevin Spacey, but just as far as talent, never been in question. So Kevin Spacey in 1995, he's great in 3 big movies and big roles. Outbreak with Dustin Hoffman and Morgan Freeman. I forgot about that. Donald Sutherland, Rene Russo, and Cuba Gooding Jr. He's brilliant in Outbreak. He is creepy as fuck in the movie Seven. He won his Oscar, though, for his turn as Verbal Kint in The Usual Suspects, directed by another somewhat notorious figure in Bryan Singer, written by a great writer-director who became a great writer-director, Christopher McQuarrie, who's done the last bunch of Mission Impossible movies with Tom Cruise. So Kevin Spacey was perfectly cast. Even though originally it's almost absurd, they wanted Ned Beatty. Because Ned Beatty, they felt he kind of looked like the Zodiac Killer as far as like the sketches of. And Ned Beatty was excited because he wasn't getting offered those kinds of roles. Ned Beatty said he read the script and said it was the most evil thing he had ever read. Fuck you, pass, I'm not interested. I don't know if that's a direct quote, but he did say, it's the most evil thing I've ever read. I don't want any part of this. Have fun making your movie. Probably thought they were all, Satan worshipers, a bunch of pagans. But the thing is, as a Gen Xer, and there are certain cliches about Generation X that are not really true, because when we were kids, we were told we were a bunch of layabouts, we were all lazy, nobody wants to do anything, your generation sucks, blah, 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 blah. But obviously that's not true. You can find individual people in any generation. But one thing that I would agree with, we are the first generation where sarcasm and snark stocks in trade. Not taking things too seriously, fuck this, fuck that, fuck this, fuck that kind of attitude. Generation X. Snark, sarcasm. Now I can confirm this on opening night at the old Levittown Metroplex, the theater that's still there, it's called something else now, on Route 24, aka Hempstead Turnpike. It was the only theater, I was still living in Woodbury at the time, that Huntington hadn't happened yet. It was the only theater in that area that was screening Seven. It's about a 15-minute ride from Woodbury, maybe not even that much, the apartment where I was, my dad's place, was just off of Route 135, like literally about 500 feet from Route 135. So went over there to see the movie, and it was a packed house. And when I tell you, there were a lot of movies that I saw in film school, because that's where I was at the time, New York University, where the movies were not funny, but the audience, the students were constantly sniping and carping and laughing at inappropriate moments. That's another thing that defines Generation X, at least as we were. Laughing inappropriately at the wrong time. So the movie Seven, that kind of very arresting, no pun intended, pre-credit sequence with the kind of scattered images and the jump cuts and the herky-jerky editing and all of that. In the entire running time of the movie Seven, I did not hear, and I have no memory of anybody talking during the film. Very few people even got up to go to the bathroom or get snacks. It's not really a snacky kind of movie. But there was no catcalling. There was no shouting at the screen. There was no, this is fucking bullshit. The entire crowd watched that movie in rapt silence. Rapt, R-A-P-T, just in case. I don't mean wrapped in silence. It's kind of funny. And when it was over, everyone sat there stunned. I don't know what I thought or how I thought the movie was going to end, but I didn't think it was going to end the way that it did. Now, I started to realize that it was probably not going to be a happy ending. But I did not in any way know what was coming. And that's to the credit, in the still somewhat pre-internet era, no one spoiled it for me. I should say, because no one had seen it, none of the major critics spoiled it for me. Siskel and Ebert didn't even say, this movie has one of the most depressing endings of it. No, they didn't say anything. I think Siskel actually liked it slightly more than Ebert. Ebert felt that with all of the, the kind of circular logic and the way everything is kind of tied together at the end, he felt that the last act was it wasn't quite as good as he thinks they thought it was. Like, there were people that he talked to that thought it was, masterpiece, brilliant all the way through. Ebert felt let down, but he still gave it 3.5 stars. But it didn't hit the masterpiece button for him. It did not reach that exalted 4 stars, but 2 thumbs up. And they both, Siskel and Ebert, not only liked the movie so much, but they loved that R. Lee Ermey was in the cast. Even though Roger Ebert was not the biggest fan of Full Metal Jacket, Siskel liked that movie more, for whatever that's worth. But Seven ended up making $327 million at the worldwide box office. It grossed almost 10 times its production cost. And people had to have told everyone to see it. But this movie, and that's why it's so incredible that it did as well as it did, because I don't know what you would call the target audience, but there are plenty of people that would never willingly go to see a movie like that. So the audience, in theory, is limited. And I know for sure, if you had asked anybody at the studio, if you had said, would you sign up for this grossing 100 million worldwide? Abso-fucking-lutely. Because it's very tricky. You can look at different movies, very heavy kind of suspense films, thrillers, gruesome, that should have been bigger hits. And they say, well, maybe it was the subject matter. Because there are plenty where everybody hits their marks. The film just doesn't do that well. So one thing that I remember, though, watching film and slowly becoming aware, the internet was in its, more or less its infancy, but slowly becoming aware that Big Brother might be watching. And this is the first movie to throw a concept like what I'm about to explain. And I don't know if it was really true or whether it was an invention of the screenwriter, Andrew Kevin Walker, but it was something that I'm still fascinated by, but just only from a different angle. But back then, I had never heard of anything which seemed as insane. So there is a beat in which our intrepid detectives, and I think more specifically Somerset, that's the Morgan's character, Somerset, they have a lead on a John Doe. It turns out to be more than a lead. It turns out that they're on exactly the right track. And Morgan says something about the Library of Congress collects data, and there are certain pieces of information, could be books, could be music, but there are certain pieces of information that if those pieces are put together, there is a red flag system in place. Now, I don't know if that was true at the time. It sure as fuck is now. But I was fascinated. So apparently, if you took out the Canterbury Tales, Dante's Inferno, and there was one other one, but if you took out Dante's Inferno, the Canterbury Tales, and maybe one other book, there was going to be a red flag put on you. Why would that make you be a red flag? I have no idea. But the decision was made in the world of the film that this, and this, boop, this person needs to be investigated. They might be a threat. I just was very disturbed by that. I guess I was a real innocent 21-year-old. I said, well, this can't be right. They're not allowed to do that. Well, who's they? The government. What do you mean they're not allowed to do that? You don't think J. Edgar Hoover was doing shit like that? Oh, okay. It's a brilliant sequence in the film. And whether or not that was in effect at the time, it sounds plausible, as upsetting as it was to me to know that it was plausible. Why would I have ever considered such a thing? But you hate to say it. And if somebody had said, well, what if a person in the early days of the internet is looking up all kinds of mechanisms to try to figure out how to build their own explosive? Same concept. But this was the first introduction to, look what can happen here. We got to keep our eye on certain people, right? And so the kind of psychology of it all, we don't know if John Doe did this to give them a head start, or whether he's a fucking lunatic, and for whatever reason, because he's a lunatic, that's why he took out those books. The psychological profile, right? We always talk about a profiler. The film has moments of where it plays a little bit like an action film. There is a chase sequence which is a little bit reminiscent of 4 years earlier, the famous chase sequence between Keanu Reeves and Ronald Reagan. It's actually Patrick Swayze wearing a Ronald Reagan mask. But this is a very noirish, very dark, and very grim. And it is just to this side of not being supernatural. It does have elements of Angel Heart, which has a significant sequence set in New Orleans. But that is supernatural. This movie is set in a grounded, visceral, real world of 1995. It's just that there are things happening that are so horrifying, it feels like, well, this can't happen. This is impossible. Who would ever do this? Well, you ask yourself a question, and we don't ever find out why John Doe does what he does. But then you look at In the Line of Fire 2 years earlier. And when Clint Eastwood realizes that the character, it's Mitch Leary, is his name, the John Malkovich character, he wants to assassinate the president. Well, we were just having a good conversation. Now, why would you go ahead and say that? Now you know I have to write a report. I fucking hate paperwork. Why? John Malkovich's Mitch Leary simply answers to punctuate the dreariness. Now, as it turns out, that's bullshit. The character of Mitch Leary has more than that. He's not trying to take this action to punctuate the dreariness. Number one, he thinks that Clint's character of Frank Horrigan is full of shit, and he doesn't have the guts to get in front of a bullet. But number two, he is a man, Mitch Leary, who has given every ounce of his life force to the United States of America. And the United States of America has fucked him over and tried to assassinate him by sending his best friend, his confederate, his comrade in arms to kill him. So he's not punctuating the dreariness. He has a legitimate axe to grind. I gave you everything I had. This is how you repay me? Fuck you. Well, in the world of the movie Seven, there's no reason at all for John Doe to do what John Doe is trying to do, other than the fact that he's probably schizophrenic. He's probably, well, we know he's a psychopath, but I believe he also is a sociopath and presumably a narcissist. He's got a whole compendium of horrific characteristics. And as played by Spacey, his line readings, just as his line readings, I don't love the movie The Usual Suspects. I feel like the whole Kaiser Soze thing, the last 30 minutes, it didn't work for me. I'm in the minority on that. There are a lot of fellow Gen Xers that will have The Usual Suspects among their, 5 favorite films ever, 10 favorite films, 2.5 stars out of 4. I recommend everybody see it. Performances are incredible. But Spacey's line readings are very precise in Seven. It's just a phenomenal performance. Well-deserved Oscar. But what he does here, his inflections are different. His line readings are a little flatter, a little bit more, for most of it, emotionless. And he's somebody that even if he is handcuffed, even it's kind of like Hannibal Lecter, even if he can't get at you physically in any way, you should just put a muzzle on this fucking guy, keep his mouth shut. You don't want to hear what he has to say. Bad things are going to happen. Better to just try to do an investigation and not listen to anything this motherfucker has to say. I do appreciate, no spoilers, but the way that Brad Pitt handles the final sequences, it works and it's believable when we realize what this film has been building towards the entire time. Because there are films that telegraph, let's say, a final gut punch. This film mildly telegraphs it, but it does it in such a way that the audience is finally catching up to the characters at the same time. And in this film, it really works. So Seven is very well remembered by history. It was only nominated for 1 Oscar. It was nominated for Best Film Editing, and it lost to Apollo 13. Well, if you ask me, Apollo 13 should have won Best Picture. Now, I'm not anti-Mel Gibson. I mean, I might think he's a little wacky, but Mel Gibson as a filmmaker, his direction of Braveheart, incredible. I think he should have been nominated for Best Actor. But Apollo 13 for me was the best film of 1995, hands down. Braveheart, you can put second, no problem. But Apollo 13 had to win something. And it's embarrassing that Ron Howard wasn't nominated for Best Director. There's no other word for it. It's embarrassing. Because I would say that's the best directed film of his entire career. Better than A Beautiful Mind, as much as I appreciate that film. Better movie than A Beautiful Mind, much as I appreciate that film. But Seven made all that money, even though I can't imagine somebody ever wanting to see this movie more than once. I've seen it once and I buzzed through it a separate time. I can go the rest of my days. No, thank you. I'm all set here. That is a testament to what David Fincher was able to achieve. That even if people said, yeah, I'll never watch this more than once, a shit ton of people went to see it that one time. If you think about films such as Titanic that had people going to see it 4, 5, 6 times, even though it's 3 hours long, I doubt that anybody saw. I mean, some people presumably saw Seven twice in theaters. But other than that, I mean, what are you doing? Unless you're, I hate to say it, unless you're a masochist, why would you want to subject yourself to it? Well, I guess it takes all kinds, right? Now, as we speak, I don't believe that Seven is streaming free on any platforms. It was on Netflix, which I was shocked by a couple of years ago. It's been on HBO or now Max. But in most cases, in most countries, you're probably going to have to rent it via Amazon Prime for a couple of bucks. And it's worth seeing. This is a great movie within that genre, but be forewarned, it's very serious and heavy stuff. This is not a fun suspense thriller. Those things do exist. Or to give you more perspective, a movie that came out just before Seven, Copycat, is also very heavy, but that film is more conventional and there are jump scares and there's a lot of edge of your seat kind of excitement. This film doesn't really go in that direction. It's really a matter of what you like. If you want the Copycat kind of suspense film, you might just be completely turned off by Seven when you realize just how grim and gruesome and heavy it is. But it is brilliant movie making. And if somebody told me, I still think that this is Fincher's finest work, no problem. I mean, I think Fight Club is better, but it's very, you can flip a coin. A number of his films. I mean, Panic Room is so brilliantly directed. What can you say about that, right? He's one of the masters, there's no question. Seven, 29 years old, released on this day, 1995. Unbelievable. Directed by David Fincher and starring Brad Pitt, Morgan Freeman, and a very strong Gwyneth Paltrow as Detective Price, Brad's character's young wife, and they're expecting a newborn. And Morgan's scene, I should point out before I close the episode, Morgan's scene with Gwyneth, when he talks about rearing a child in this world, in this climate of 29 years ago, it's beautiful. It's some of Morgan's finest film acting. This has been episode 312 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Sunday morning here with me in New York. If you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Till then, what's in the box? Peace.